Kelsey. This is my channel, The Fancy Hat Lady Reads. I'm wearing one of my fancy booktube hats, and today I'm bringing you my Booktube-A-Thon wrap-up. Now, in case you're unaware, because I know I have a lot of new subscribers on this channel over the last few weeks, so welcome. I often post all of my wrap-ups on the later side of things as opposed to on the sooner side of things. So yes, I'm aware that Booktube-A-Thon ended a couple weeks ago. I'm also aware that I haven't yet posted any wrap-ups for the month of July, but that's kind of just how I roll. That's how I feel more comfortable doing it. I tend to feel that I personally need some time to think about a book and let it settle in my mind and mull it over between the time I read it and the time I talk about it. So I'm not a booktuber who's going to apologize to you for a wrap-up being late. I know that in my viewing experience it doesn't matter to me at all, and I feel like generally speaking the quality of my wrap-ups has improved as I've taken that pressure off of myself for the wrap-ups to be timely. So that was my little spiel. The 2017 Booktube-A-Thon was from July 24th to 40th. There are always 7 reading challenges for the Booktube-A-Thon with a goal of reading 7 books. I had 7 books on my TBR this year. I got to 5 of them, so that's not total victory, but it was a pretty good amount of reading. I'm going to tell you first what books I read met which challenges, and then I'm going to talk about the books individually. The first challenge was to read a book with a person on the cover. All of my books that I read had people on the cover, but the one that only filled this challenge was The King of Elfland's Daughter by Lord Dunsany. Number 2 was to read a hyped book, and for this I read Lumberjanes Volume 1, Beware the Kitten Holy. Challenge number 3 was to read a book completely in one day. I actually read 2 different books in one day apiece. The first was Lumberjanes, and then the second was Chocky by Wyndham. Challenge 4 was to read a book with a protagonist who's very different from you. For this, I read If I Was Your Girl by Meredith Russo, which is a YA contemporary with a transgender protagonist. Number 5 was to finish a book completely outdoors. For this, I read The Princess and the Goblin by MacDonald. This actually wasn't too much of a problem for me because I, on Friday of the readathon, camped out for tickets for Shakespeare in the Park, and I got over half of this book read just waiting in line for tickets that morning. And then on Saturday, the weather was not obliging. It was drizzly and drippy, but then Sunday was nice again, the last day of the readathon, and I was able to finish up the book sitting outside on a park bench. Challenges 6 and 7 were the 2 that I didn't complete. Challenge 6 was to read a book that you bought because of the cover. The book that I had picked out for this was The Tale of Gwyn by Cynthia Voigt. I did not get to this book. And the 7th book that I had picked out for the final challenge to read 7 books would have been Odyssey Cycle 1. This one I'm hoping to get to this month because I have it out from the library and I have to get it back. But I don't know when I'll get to The Tale of Gwyn. So I think my sort of main read, the most ambitious read, the one that took up most of my time and energy during the readathon week, was The King of Elfland's Daughter. This is a classic fantasy novel from the 20s. It's from, let me get the exact date. It's was published in 1924. This is the first thing by Lord Dunsany I've ever read. Lord Dunsany is considered to be a classic fantasy writer because his work influenced Tolkien and also apparently Lovecraft. And I started this book on the first day of the Booktube-A-Thon, and I continued reading it throughout the entire week. It did take me the whole week to read, despite being very short, because Dunsany's writing is very, very dense. But I was fascinated with this book. There's a whole lot that I think I'll be sort of juggling around in my mind from this book in terms of fantasy writing, plot structure, tropes, subgenre. What this feels like to me is this feels like it's coming out of the 19th century literary fairy tale tradition. But it's sort of trying to become high fantasy without knowing that high fantasy is like a thing it could become. And as someone who has sort of seen those 2 fantasy traditions as being like inherently separate and not much in communication with each other for most of my reading life, this was absolutely fascinating. So this takes place in a town called Earl, where the men of the Parliament of Earl, at the very beginning, they come before their lord and they say, we would like magic in Earl, please. Specifically, they say they wish to be ruled by a magic lord because they are tired of their town existing in obscurity and they want to be renowned and known in legend throughout the world. And right from the start, like, you can tell this isn't going to go how they planned, right? But the lord is obliging and he sends his son Alveric into Elfland because Elfland happens to be conveniently located nearby, to take the king of Elfland's daughter, Lyrizel, back into our world and to wed her and to make her his lady. And the whole book is in large part dealing with the way the people in, as he terms it, the fields we know, or our world, view magic and view Elfland, and how different it is from our experience, and also how Lyrizel and the things and people from Elfland see our world with similar and parallel fascination. Time is a thing that doesn't exist in Elfland. In Elfland, time stands still. And so time and time moving is something that Lyrizel and the creatures of Elfland, there are trolls in this who eventually make their way over into our world and find everything here hilarious. But they find the movement of time fascinating and glorious and magical, and yet it is also the cause of old age and death and loss, which is why the King of Elfland does not allow time to pass in his realm. And I'd rather not talk too much about the plot, except to say that it takes a lot of different turns that are hard to predict. Like, most of the book, I was wildly guessing at how it would end. And yet, every twist of the plot felt natural and right to me, I think because on so many levels, all of it resonated with fairy tale plot structures. You have a witch named Zerundara, which is just the coolest name ever for a witch, who is called upon for advice in various situations. You have Lyrizel herself, who is very directly compared to the fairy tale trope of a mermaid who has forsaken the sea. And you also have the theme of religious condemnation of all things magic. This fear that everything from Elfland is unholy, and conversely you get this really interesting perspective from Elfland, the king's understanding that his daughter could never belong in human's conception of heaven, that it would be a tragic ending for her if she were allowed to die as a Christian and go to heaven because that's incompatible with her nature as an elven being. So I felt like there was a lot to unpack in this, and I'll definitely continue mulling it over in months and years to come. In terms of what feels like high fantasy to me, there's a magic sword. There are two different quests, one of which is a solo quest, and the other one of which is kind of your traditional, like, questing band of rugged misfits. And I kind of got the sense reading this that Lord Dunsany would have let this just be a secondary world fantasy if that were an accepted thing that broadly existed at the time he was writing this. What's interesting is there's very little reference to real world, the outside world at all. In fact, none whatsoever until one chapter, let me see if I can find it, Chapter 20, called A Historical Fact, where he uses just like one magical artifact to tie it into the real world and give us this sort of arbitrary feeling date of it's probably about 1530. And he says, I mention the date because there are those who care little for a tale if it not be here and there supported by history. And like, other than that one mention in that one chapter, this totally could be a secondary world fantasy. Even though I think generally, like, fairy tales are accepted to be a sort of fantastical vision of our own world. And then it was Tolkien who made massive world building a thing, right? And then, like, all the other fantasy writers grabbed that and ran with it. I mentioned that the writing is very dense. That is true. It's very lyrical, very poetic. There's a lot of repetition of key phrases, just like there's a lot of repetition of themes kind of poked at over and over again in slightly different ways. So I really liked this book. It was something I found a little more intellectually fascinating than, you know, emotionally gripping. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. It's definitely something I'm very glad to have read. So The King of Elfland's Daughter, I started first and spent all week reading. The next thing I started and finished, all of these are going to be in the order that I read them after that, is Lumberjanes Volume 1, Beware the Kitten Holy, with a team of writers. Let's see, this is written by Noelle Stevenson and Grace Ellis, illustrated by Brooke Allen. Bunch of other people I don't know who's really, like, significant in mentioning in credits for graphic novels, but those are the main people. I enjoyed this, and I may continue with the series at some point, but I think I was ultimately really underwhelmed by it just because this has so much hype. And this is one of those graphic novels where I feel like not enough happened in a volume for me to care. By the way, this is frequently a problem with graphic novels for me. Like, it's a problem all the time. This is about a group of girls who are all in the same cabin at a summer camp. They stumble into some sort of weird, magical, raucous adventures. Their camp counselor despairs of keeping them in line. Each chapter is kind of headed up by this random sort of page excerpt from the Lumberjanes field manual that often just, like, cuts off in the middle of a sentence, and I didn't quite know what to think of that framing device. It didn't totally work for me. I know people really love the kind of colorful art in this. It's not really my type of comic and graphic novel art, but I see why some people think it's a lot of fun. My favorite thing about this was probably pretty obviously the feminism. These girls go on great adventures, and there's one specific scene where they run into a group of boy campers from a nearby camp, and the guys are like, "Oh, come over, we will serve you tea and cookies," and it's great. But this was only 3 stars for me because there just wasn't enough plot. You get these little sort of magical puzzle solving moments, so I guess these girls are all working towards solving some magical mystery, but it's nowhere near anything I really care about as a narrative arc as of yet. My next book was another 3-star read. This is Chocky by John Wyndham. This was technically a reread for me because I remember I read this book as a kid. I know that I read it with this cover, which is terrifying, and that may be part of why I remember being kind of terrified by this book. When I was a kid, I didn't find it terrifying this time. I mostly just found it a little bit boring. I'd mentioned before that before I reread either of these books, I had conflated this book in my reading memory with The Revolving Boy by Gertrude Friedberg, which is also an old-fashioned sci-fi book. And reading these both, I can see why I did that. They're both kind of domestic sci-fi stories about little boys who have some strange things going on with them and how their parents react to that. So if you want to hear what I thought of this book, I'll link the wrap-up where I talked about it. But this was published in 1968. I believe it was John Wyndham's final book, and it's known for being drastically different from everything else he wrote. Now, I think Wyndham is best known for having written some kind of like sci-fi alien disaster books, which I frankly have very little interest in reading. This is kind of the only book of his I'm interested in. This would have been a contemporary book when it was written. It takes place at the time it was written. It's not a future world or anything. It's about a little boy named Matthew who develops what his parents at first think is an imaginary friend that seems to be different from a normal imaginary friend, and they start to wonder what's going on with him. It becomes clear eventually that this imaginary friend, Chocky, is actually a real presence of some sort that is speaking to him in his mind. Now, the narrator of this story is Matthew's father, and I frankly found him to be a really uninteresting narrator. He's kind of just like the most generic dad character you can possibly imagine. The mother is kind of the most generic mom character you can possibly imagine. She's going into, like, hysterics over the health and safety of her son, and Dad is the one who's kind of got things under control. Similarly, their son Matthew is constantly described as having been, before this thing took up residence in his mind, as being just this absolutely average, normal kid. And it's like his parents don't know how to talk about him in any other terms except just like his normality. So no one in this family was interesting in any way, and I thought that was a downfall. What is interesting is Chocky. Now, Chocky is observing humanity and Earth. We can figure that out pretty early on, and Chocky has a lot of questions that Matthew has to find the answers for to try and explain. And Chocky is also apparently highly opinionated and rather condescending towards a lot of human stuff. Now, one of the most interesting things here, I think, is that one of the things that Chocky doesn't understand about life on Earth is gender. And so there's a kind of fascinating scene where Matthew and his dad sit down and try to decide what pronouns to use for Chocky. And they eventually decide that she's female because Matthew thinks that she behaves a little bit more like his friends' sisters than like any of the boys he knows at school. But it is clearly stated that Chocky is essentially genderless, so that's interesting. And I guess the whole point of this book is a sort of look at the state of humanity and what we're maybe getting right as a species and what we're maybe getting horribly wrong. And in that sense, it's really interesting and I liked it. But it was just the characters that fell flat for me. Chocky is really the most interesting character in the book. There's a reason that she's the title character. She's a fascinating alien presence, benevolent alien presence, and it's a pity that she only speaks throughout most of the book directly to Matthew, who is not the narrator. The narrator is the dad, who only hears about what's happening with Chocky through Matthew. But I gave this book 3 out of 5 stars. I thought it was interesting, but ultimately it wasn't emotionally compelling in any way for me, and I think it's gonna prove to be pretty forgettable. Interestingly, comparing these two books again, reading this one, I remembered a whole lot because I found myself emotionally attached to the child character who's at the center of this, and I remembered on my reread being attached to him as a kid. This one, I remembered nothing about this book, and I kind of don't think I will because it didn't connect with me in the same way at all. I think comparing the two, though, Chocky probably has bigger and more interesting ideas. So next, my outdoor read, The Princess and the Goblin by George MacDonald. This is another classic fantasy, except this one is for kids, whereas The King of Elfland's Daughter is for adults. This is older. This was published in 1872. This is just like a charming, charming story. It's super sweet, totally whimsical. I loved the whimsy of this. This is about a little girl named Irene, who is a princess living on this estate with her nanny, while her father, the king, travels throughout the land doing benevolent things. Unfortunately, the kingdom has some enemies. There are goblins living inside the mountain who are resentful of the king and his family and want to take them down. One day, Irene finds a stairway that brings her to unused rooms where she finds a magical-seeming woman who claims to be her great-great-grandmother, but no one else will believe her that her great-great-grandmother is real. And we also meet a boy named Curdy, who comes from a mining family and works in the mines with his father. He encounters the strands of an evil goblin plot of some sort, and starts to try and unravel what the goblins are plotting and if he can stop them. This is just totally charming. I don't know what else to say about it. It is heartwarming, and I liked it, and I gave it 4 stars. This also has what I think are the original illustrations, if you care for such things. And the last book that I read was If I Was Your Girl by Meredith Russo. This is an Own Voices trans book about a girl named Amanda who starts at a new school. Now, I don't read a lot of YA contemporary, mostly I think because I don't like reading about high school for a lot of reasons that I don't need to go into right now. But I do think it's worthwhile in the spirit of the challenge to read a book about someone who is different from you, to read about a high school experience that I know going into the book isn't going to reflect my own, but may reflect the high school experiences of perhaps people I know or people I will know in the future. I think a lot of the reasons that I don't like reading YA contemporary come back to me constantly comparing it to my own high school experience and feeling crappy about it. And I think with something like this, I could kind of let go of that for a bit. So at the start of this book, Amanda has not only moved to switch schools, she has moved in with her father, whom she hasn't seen since her parents split before her transition. So there are sort of 2 things going on here with this move. First of all, she's starting at a new school. She's meeting new people. Her goal is to sort of lie low and just get through this year so she can graduate. She's sort of fleeing traumatic experiences in the place that she was before. And so she doesn't want anyone to know that she's trans. She just wants to get out of there as soon as she can. But instead of being able to totally lie low, she ends up making a bunch of friends, including one particular guy friend, and she starts to date this guy. But she's also trying to forge this new relationship with her sort of estranged father, who wants the best for her and wants her to be safe, but maybe isn't approaching that in the healthiest possible way. So that's the present day storyline, and then we also get a lot of flashback chapters to times before and during Amanda's transition. So we end up getting bits and pieces of her backstory that come together. We learn fairly early on that she has survived a suicide attempt, and that's sort of a major catalyst for coming out as trans and making these life changes. One of the things that I was actually struck with most strongly in this book in terms of a high school experience being very different from my own had nothing to do with Amanda being trans and more to do with the fact that this takes place in the rural South. And for me, I've always lived in big liberal northern cities in the United States. I've never spent any real time in the South. And reading about high school in that region of the country, it just feels on some levels like reading about a foreign country, like it's a totally different experience. And I in no way want to claim that I've only lived in communities that had no transphobia or no homophobia. I think those things definitely exist even in liberal enclaves, and I'm of course privileged that I'm not personally harmed by those things. But seeing the complete ignorance as to even the existence of trans people that Amanda faces over the course of this book, and also the homophobia and a lot of the, Christian religious conservative right stuff. All of that is sort of a shock to my system just to realize how prevalent that actually is in parts of the country that I live in. And so a major takeaway from this book for me was how real and justified a lot of Amanda's fears are. I'm gonna finish this up talking a bit about the author's author note in the back, because I don't think you can review this book properly without addressing it. She points out that there are specific things that she's done in this book to make Amanda a more broadly acceptable protagonist, and that she knows that it doesn't encompass the wide range of the actual teenage trans experience, and that she's done some of these things on purpose to sort of normalize transness in a young adult contemporary narrative, and to make it as easy as possible for every stripe of reader to accept Amanda as a normal teenage girl. So for example, Amanda passes pretty perfectly, and no one at her new school has any way of knowing that she's trans unless she tells them. That's a luxury that not all trans teenagers have. And so this author is very clear that for a variety of reasons, Amanda's experience is not going to reflect every trans person's experience. But overall, I thought this was a pretty great book, and I'm really glad I read it, and I gave it 4 stars. So here again is what I read for Booktube-A-Thon. Let me know if you've read any of these, if you want to read any of them, what you think, how you're doing. Anyhow, I hope you're having a nice day. That is all. Bye for now.